Welcome to the Healthy AF podcast. Have you ever wondered why our highly flawed nutrition guidelines that have only proliferated metabolic disease continue down the same path despite decades of failure? There appears to be a strong driving force behind them. I'm your host, Zane Griggs, sharing with you what I have learned in 25 years as a fitness professional about nutrition, exercise, sleep, and many more lifestyle strategies to help you become healthy AF, healthy after 50. Now, the first iteration of the food guidelines was the famous food pyramid. We all remember that, recommending 6 to 11 servings of grains. Can you imagine eating that many grains, that much grains? That's a lot of grains. Potatoes, rice, pastas, breads, lots of grains there. Any wonder why, people started gaining weight? Well, the guidelines were established in 1979 by a coalition of mostly politicians, led by Senator George McGovern, and a few nutrition scientists, one of which was a guy named Mark Hegsted, who was you probably heard this story, one of the Harvard nutrition scientists paid by the Sugar Research Foundation to promote studies that basically blamed saturated fat for heart disease and discredit studies that blamed sugar for heart disease. And he later became head of the USDA, which gave him the authority to draft the nutrition guidelines in 1979, this coalition. Now, the link to that story, if you haven't read it, from New York Times, it's in the show notes. JAMA, Journal, American Medical Association, is also published an article on it. But these guidelines were illustrated in the now famous food pyramid that came out in 1980. And the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Council or Committee, Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, puts out updated nutrition recommendations every 5 years. And they're mostly the same ideas in a new package, kind of like the plate. When the plate came out, it was the same idea, very little change. We have seen some improvements, like in 2015, when they basically removed the limit on dietary cholesterol and total fat. Before that, they had said, you can only take in 300 milligrams of dietary cholesterol per day. Absolutely ridiculous. And then they limited total fat intake. But in light of the scientific evidence, they just couldn't continue with those recommendations any longer, even though you may still hear some doctors and dietitians continue to recommend limiting dietary cholesterol. They say, just be safe, just be cautious. The truth is we absorb very little dietary cholesterol from our diet, maybe 10%-ish, give or take, could be 5, could be 15. But our liver makes the majority of our cholesterol, followed by the majority of the cells in our body make their own cholesterol for their cellular membranes. If our bodies need more cholesterol than our liver can keep up with, which is we often do absorb some, like I said, about 10, maybe 20% tops. But it can just absorb it from our diet to make up for what our liver can't make. If our liver needs more, we absorb more. If our liver's doing just fine producing what it's producing, then we absorb less. But also something else to consider is that much of the cholesterol that comes, without getting too deep in the weeds on the science there, a lot of the cholesterol that comes into our system is not absorbable by our gut. So there's a very small percentage of it that we can it's in a form that we can absorb. So most of it just passes right on through. So we're limited by both our body's need, because it already has a very strong source of cholesterol production, the liver, and the dietary form of the cholesterol that we eat. So they still continue to push limits on dietary saturated fat, despite so much evidence in peer-reviewed studies that show no health risk from saturated fat. So from really the beginning, our nutrition guidelines were directed by politics and food industry financial influence, like the Sugar Foundation with Mark Hegsted. The industry influence has only increased over the decades, solidifying the relationship between the processed food industry, the academic research from our most prestigious universities, and government established entities like the USDA, the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, and the Academy of Nutrition Dietetics, who basically creates the education for and certifies our registered dietitians. So quite the little trinity there. So as you go through the grocery store, you'll see, hundreds of brands down the aisles, right? Depending on your grocery store, maybe thousands. But there's so many different food brands, right? How can such a variety of brands be so organized to exert so much influence? Well, that's because there's really 10 major brands that own the majority of the smaller brands that you see. Brands like PepsiCo, Coca-Cola, General Mills, Mars, Kraft Heinz, Procter & Gamble. They each own maybe another 50 or more smaller brands. These 10 brands are also the sponsors of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, as well as the USDA, and have influence over the members of the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Council. You'll see the graphic of the 10 major brands and then all the brands that they own in the show notes. So last year in 2022, we had some published articles come out about the degree of industry influence over these organizations. One in particular was regarding the conflicts of interest with the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Council. Let me just quote it. Our analysis found that 95% of the committee members had a conflict of interest with the food and or pharmaceutical industries, and that particular actors, including Kellogg's, Abbott, Kraft, Mead Johnson, General Mills, Dannon, and the International Life Sciences, had connections with multiple members, research funding, and membership of an advisory or executive board jointly accounted for more than 60% of the total number of conflicts of interest documented. So there was 95% of them found to have a conflict of interest. 60% of that was made up of research funding, membership of an advisory board or executive. So their committee members are on the board of these companies being paid to advise them, which is just, to me, unbelievable. You're basically advising the boards of people you're supposed to be regulating and profiting from your advice. I'm not even sure why that's permitted, but that's apparently how it works in Washington. The other article that came out last year was regarding the corporate capture of the AND, which is the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, was to certify our nutritionists, our registered dietitians. Just a quickly quote it as well. The A&D and the A&D Foundation, which is like a separate entity, and its key leaders have ongoing interactions with corporations. These include A&D's leaders holding key positions in multinational food, pharmaceutical, and agribusiness corporations, and A&D accepting corporate financial contributions. We found the A&D has invested funds in corporations such as Nestle, PepsiCo, and pharmaceutical companies, and has discussed internal policies to fit industry needs, and has had public positions favoring corporations. They found that the A&D had become a pro-industry voice with positions that clash with its original mission of public health. So the A&D is accepting funds, not only as sponsors, but really contributions, really. So they're just here, take this money. You don't have to give anything back. Then they were turning around and investing in those companies and discussing their internal policies within the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, discussing their policies with those corporations to fit their needs. In other words, hey, we want to pass this policy. We want to promote this policy. Is that going to be okay with you? Is that going to clash with what you're trying to market to the public? Basically, that's what. So they became, as they found, a pro-industry voice, pro-processed food industry, pharmaceutical industry voice, to the point that their positions, their policy positions, were in conflict with public health. Now, if you caught my episode on seed oils, you heard how metabolic diseases like obesity, heart disease, and type 2 diabetes were rare or unheard of prior to the 1900s when processed food entered our food system. It's not really hard to connect processed food with the level of metabolic disease we have, not only in the US, but all over the world. Because let's face it, we've exported our bad health, right? So this level of influence over our nutrition authorities by processed food and pharmaceutical companies is not only excusable, but completely invalidates their recommendations, at least in my opinion. So the USDA, the DGAC, which is Dietary Guidelines Advisory Council, and the A&D, Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, as well as other nutrition research that comes out of our academic institutions like Harvard and Tufts, which is also heavily funded by these corporations. Recommendations, right, that vilify, what do we know they've been vilifying for decades, right? Meat, full fat dairy, raw dairy, right? It's basically saturated fat coming from animal foods. That's been the big villain for more than 50 years now, more like 70 really. But from these guidelines, it's been officially, and they promoted plant-based replacements of these foods as if they're equivalent or somehow superior in health benefit. And of course, the classic processed low-fat foods, we all know, well, those of you who came through the 80s and 90s, you know, the big low-fat push with the heart healthy symbols. The heart healthy symbols were actually still on them not that many years ago. The little heart healthy on the package they got from the American Heart Association. They paid a lot of money to the American Heart Association for those little labels. And that's basically all they had to do was register the food, send a check. So we really were sincere in looking for real nutrition information, really solid nutrition. We have to find alternative sources for our nutrition information that's free of industry influence, right? And really go back to eating the kind of foods we were eating, for example, the late 1800s, before we had metabolic disease just running rampant through our country, right? Foods that would have come off a farm, like meat, full fat dairy, and eggs, which were basic staples for pretty much everything, right? Cooking our own food with whole food sources of all types, right? Using animal fats for cooking, like tallow, butter, lard. Metabolic disease has become the norm, with an estimate of about 80% of the U.S. being metabolically unhealthy, according to a study from the University of North Carolina. 42% of the U.S. is obese. That was as of 2018, with 50% obesity as a projection for 2030. Heart disease is the number one killer of people. About 40% of the U.S. is type 2 diabetic or pre-diabetic. In other words, insulin resistant to the point they're moving in the direction of becoming diabetes. And non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is becoming the number one cause of liver transplants. That was not the case 20 years ago. Our diet in the U.S. is made up of 65% processed food. It's not a coincidence, right? It can't be. If you don't want what they got, don't do what they do. And I get it. Change me hard, especially when everyone else seems to be doing the opposite of what you're trying to do, right? Like if you're eating pizza and throwing down French fries and having a couple drinks every night after work, that's normal. That's okay. That's balance, right? That's moderation. But you try cutting out processed food and primarily eating like healthy cuts of meat with some vegetables, maybe some fruit, avoiding alcohol, avoiding, sugary drinks. You're kind of a weirdo. People, you're on an extreme diet. That's extreme. Eating whole food is extreme. That's why we have the Healthy AF Club, because it's really like-minded people encouraging each other and sharing solutions and what they have overcome with their lifestyle changes, right? As well as weekly coaching Q&A from me. But hey, that's sounds like it's resonating with you. Check it out. The link will be in the show notes. And now I encourage you, go enjoy cooking your dinner. It's not a chore. It needs to be something you enjoy and have faith in, knowing that you are the outlier, doing what most people won't do for your own health and the health of your family.